February 2021. Texas. The power grid collapses. Overnight, more than 4.5 million homes go dark. Temperatures plunge into the single digits. Pipes burst. Furnaces go silent. In a state that produces more energy than any other in the United States, millions of people are suddenly unable to do the most basic thing our species has done for 300,000 years. They cannot keep warm. Over 200 people die, some from hypothermia, some from carbon monoxide poisoning, desperately running generators and gas grills indoors. In the wealthiest, most energy-rich nation on Earth, families huddle under every blanket they own, watching their breath freeze in their own living rooms. Meanwhile, in a rural homestead outside of Lubbock, a retired masonry contractor and his wife ride out the entire storm in relative comfort. No generator, no gas heater. Their secret is sitting in the fireplace, a stack of dense fire bricks, slowly heated over the course of the afternoon, then wrapped in heavy wool blankets and placed around the bedroom. Those bricks hold their warmth for nearly 8 hours. While their neighbors' $600 electric heaters sit useless in the dark, this couple sleeps through the coldest night Texas has seen in a generation, kept alive by an object that costs $3 at any hardware store. That object harnesses a principle of physics so old, so fundamental, that the Roman Empire built an entire civilization around it. It requires no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no monthly subscription, no fuel lines, and no maintenance. So here is the question worth sitting with. In an industry now valued at well over $100 billion a year, why is this the one solution nobody talks about? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is something far more ordinary and far more powerful. It is economics. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today we are opening the vault on the forgotten science of thermal mass, the ancient survival technologies our ancestors perfected, and the modern business model that made sure you never learned about them. By the end of this video, you will look at a simple clay brick and the very concept of keeping your family warm in a completely different light. Let's begin. Part 1. The physics of the $3 miracle. To understand why a simple fired clay brick can rival an expensive modern appliance, we need to step into the invisible world of heat. And the science here is genuinely stunning. It comes down to a concept called thermal inertia and a measurement known as specific heat capacity. Think of a brick as a sponge, but instead of absorbing water, it absorbs thermal energy. When you plug in a standard 1500-watt electric space heater, it immediately starts blasting hot air. It feels great, but the moment you pull the plug or the power grid fails, the room goes cold within minutes. That heater has zero thermal inertia. It creates heat, but it stores absolutely none. A dense fired clay brick is the opposite. It absorbs heat slowly, locks it deep inside its mass, and releases it slowly. Engineers call this behavior a thermal flywheel. Once the brick is charged with heat, it resists cooling down the way a heavy flywheel resists slowing down. Here is where it gets remarkable. Thermal engineers have consistently demonstrated that a standard 2-kilogram fire brick, heated to around 250 degrees Fahrenheit, releases over 90% of its stored energy gradually over a period of 6 to 8 hours. A comparable electric ceramic heater, once unplugged, dumps all its heat and goes dead cold in under 90 minutes. The brick keeps warming long after the machine dies, and it does so through what scientists call long-wave infrared radiation. This is not the blast of hot air from a space heater that dries your skin and heats the ceiling. This is a gentle, deeply penetrating warmth that heats your body directly, the way sunlight warms your face on a cold morning. Fired clay holds roughly twice the thermal energy of wood and about 50% more than concrete per kilogram. It is one of the most efficient heat sponges nature has ever produced. And this leads us to a question that reframes everything we think we know about staying warm. Why do we spend a fortune trying to heat the vast, empty air in our living rooms when our ancestors survived ice ages by simply heating the objects closest to their bodies? Part 2. The Ancient Masters of Warmth. Our ancestors did not survive brutal winters by being tougher than us. They survived by being more precise. They understood that heat was a precious, finite resource, and they built their entire lives around capturing every last trace of it. To see this at its most brilliant, we need to travel to northern China, to the freezing plains of Manchuria, where winter temperatures routinely drop to -30 degrees Celsius. For over 2,000 years, the families here have survived using a masterpiece of low-tech engineering called the Kang. The Kang is not what you might picture. It is a massive, elevated platform bed, sometimes taking up nearly half the room, built entirely from compacted earth, stone, and fired clay bricks. But the genius is hidden inside. The internal cavity of the Kang is a labyrinth of winding channels, called flues, that connect directly to the cooking stove in the adjacent kitchen. Here is how it works. When the family cooked their evening meal, the hot exhaust smoke, which in a modern home would simply be vented out a chimney and wasted to the sky, was instead forced to travel through this brick maze beneath the sleeping platform before finally exiting the house. Hundreds of kilograms of dense brick absorbed the heat from the smoke as it passed through. By the time the family finished eating and went to bed, the cooking fire had been dead for an hour. But the surface of the Kang was a steady, radiating 40 degrees Celsius. Not hot enough to burn, just warm enough to feel like the earth itself was holding you. The room's air might be near freezing, but the family slept in complete, luxurious warmth under thick cotton quilts. They burned no extra fuel. They used no extra energy. They simply refused to waste the heat they had already created. Think about that for a moment. A technology so elegant that cooking dinner also heated the bedroom. Zero waste, zero moving parts, zero recurring cost. 2,000 years before the first electric bill was ever written. We see this same principle across the ancient world, but nowhere more dramatically than in Russia. By the 15th century, Russian families had perfected the Russkaya pech, the Russian stove, a colossal masonry heater built from hundreds of clay tiles and bricks, sometimes weighing over a ton. The family would burn a single, intense fire for just 90 minutes. Then they let the fire die. The sheer mass of the stove absorbed so much thermal energy that it radiated a gentle, steady warmth for a full 24 hours. The stove was so effective and so warm to the touch that families built sleeping platforms directly on top of it. Grandparents and children slept on the stove itself, wrapped in blankets, in rooms where the air temperature hovered near freezing. In Russian folklore, the stove was not just furniture, it was the heart of the household. Families were born near it, healed beside it, and stories were told on top of it for generations. They did not have an app to control their climate. They had something better, a partnership with the physical world. Part 3. The Great Forgetting. So what happened? How did a technology this effective, this cheap, and this reliable become something almost no one in the modern world knows about? The honest answer is not a shadowy conspiracy. It is something more familiar, a business model. By the 1920s, the coal and wood stove industries had begun consolidating. By the 1950s, the post-war construction boom brought electric and gas heating into the mass consumer market. And with that shift came a subtle but profound change in how people thought about warmth. Through decades of marketing, the public internalized a new assumption. Heat is a service. To be warm, you need a machine. You need a product. You need to pay a utility company every single month, forever. Warmth became something you subscribe to. Think about the economics for a moment. The average American household spends nearly $2,000 a year on heating and cooling. A quality electric space heater costs anywhere from $80 to $600, with a functional lifespan of maybe 3 to 5 years before it breaks and ends up in a landfill. Over a decade, a typical family spends thousands of dollars just replacing plastic heating appliances. Now, Consider the clay brick. You cannot patent fired clay. The technology is 4,000 years old. You cannot sell a subscription service for a rock. You cannot install a smart thermostat inside a brick. And you cannot charge a monthly fee for the dirt in a riverbed. This is not about anyone sitting in a boardroom plotting to suppress brick knowledge. It is simpler than that. Products that cannot be patented receive no marketing budget. Technologies that cannot generate recurring revenue attract no venture capital. Solutions that last a lifetime are invisible in an economy built on planned obsolescence. The brick did not fail. It was simply not profitable enough to promote. Modern building codes, developed with significant input from heating industry stakeholders, increasingly mandated grid-connected systems. Not because thermal mass was dangerous or ineffective, but because standardized, inspectable, insurable systems were easier to regulate at scale. The legitimate need for safety standards became, over time, a structural barrier to older, simpler alternatives. And so, generation by generation, the knowledge faded. Not suppressed by force, but outcompeted by marketing. We traded our thermal autonomy for the convenience of a monthly bill. We became subscribers to warmth. Part 4. The Terracotta Trap. What not to do. Now, because buried knowledge has a way of resurfacing in distorted forms, people have recently started waking up to the power of thermal mass. You may have seen viral videos on social media showing people building DIY heaters using a terracotta flower pot overturned on top of a few tea light candles. The videos claim this setup magically amplifies the heat of the candles and can warm an entire room for pennies. Before we go any further, we need to talk about this, because the viral terracotta pot heater is not only a scientific myth, it is genuinely dangerous. The first law of thermodynamics is absolute. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. A single tea light candle produces about 30 to 40 watts of heat. If you put a clay pot over 3 candles, you are still only getting the heat output of 3 candles. The pot does not create energy. It absorbs some of the heat temporarily and then releases it. But the total output is identical. There is no amplification. There is no magic. But the safety issues are the real concern, and fire departments around the world are actively warning people about 3 specific dangers. First, thermal shock. Terracotta flower pots are porous and hold microscopic pockets of trapped moisture. If a candle heats the pot too quickly or unevenly, that moisture flashes to steam, expands violently, and the pot can literally explode, sending sharp ceramic fragments across your living room. Second, carbon monoxide. Candles require oxygen to burn cleanly. By trapping them under a pot with restricted airflow, you create conditions for incomplete combustion. This produces carbon monoxide, the silent, odorless killer. Using this setup in a sealed room during a winter power outage, which is exactly when people try it, is a recipe for tragedy. Third, flashover. When you crowd multiple paraffin wax candles together under a dome, the trapped heat creates an oven effect. The pooled melted wax can reach its auto-ignition temperature, over 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and the entire pool of wax ignites simultaneously. This is a grease fire. It cannot be extinguished with water. People have burned down homes and boats attempting this hack. The ancients did not use uncontrolled open flames under fragile garden pottery inside their sleeping quarters. They used solid, tempered mass, safely heated away from the living space and then brought into it. The difference is everything. Part 5. Harnessing the $3 miracle today. If you are camping in freezing temperatures, if your power grid fails during a winter storm, or if you simply want to reclaim a piece of the thermal independence your ancestors took for granted, here is exactly how you safely harness the power of the thermal brick. Step 1. Choose the right material. This matters more than anything else. Do not use concrete blocks, cinder blocks, or standard paving bricks. Concrete cannot handle sustained high heat and will degrade, crack, or even explosively shatter. Go to a hardware store or masonry supply and buy fired clay bricks, or even better, refractory fire bricks. These are dense, heavy, and engineered to withstand temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Fahrenheit without cracking. They typically cost between $1 and $3 each. Step 2. Temper the brick before first use. This is a lost masonry secret that prevents disaster. Even a brand new fire brick absorbs moisture from the air. If you throw a cold, damp brick into a roaring fire, the trapped moisture flashes to steam, and the brick can violently crack or burst. Instead, build a small fire and place the brick nearby to warm gently. The next day, bring it a little closer to a slightly hotter fire. Over 2 or 3 days, you slowly drive all the microscopic moisture from the stone. After this, the brick is ready for life. Step 3. Charge the thermal battery. When you need heat, place your tempered fire brick near your campfire, on a gas burner, or in a rocket stove for about 45 minutes to an hour. You want slow, even heat penetrating deep into the mass. The brick should be far too hot to touch with bare hands, but it should never glow red. A red glow means you have pushed it past 800 degrees, which is unnecessary, wastes energy, and risks damaging the brick over time. Step 4. Wrap it properly. This is the most critical step for safety and comfort. Never place a bare, heated brick against skin, clothing, or a sleeping bag. Wrap the brick in a thick, 100% natural wool blanket or heavy cotton canvas. Never use synthetic materials like polyester or nylon. Synthetics melt at relatively low temperatures and will fuse to the hot brick, creating a fire hazard and a burn risk. The thick wool acts as a regulator. It prevents contact burns and slows the rate of heat release, transforming the brick from a brief, intense hazard into a gentle, radiating battery that lasts all night. Step 5. Think zonal, not whole room. Place the wrapped brick at the foot of your sleeping bag, in the center of a small tent, or inside an enclosed emergency shelter. You are not trying to heat the vast, empty air of a living room. You are heating the microclimate immediately surrounding your body. This is exactly what the Kang builders and Russian stove families understood. Warm the person, not the space. 2 standard fire bricks, properly heated and wrapped, can maintain a comfortable sleeping temperature in a small tent for 6 to 8 hours, even when the outside air drops to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. No fuel burns while you sleep. No carbon monoxide risk in your enclosed space. No noise. Just the silent, patient physics of the earth keeping you alive through the night. A word of honest caution. This method is not a replacement for a properly insulated, professionally heated home. It will not warm a large, open-concept living room. It is a targeted survival tool, a camping advantage, and a backup for grid failures, and it excels in those roles. Know its strengths and its limits. Part 6. The future is a brick? Here is where this story takes a turn that borders on poetic. Right now, the biggest unsolved problem in renewable energy is not generation. Solar panels and wind turbines produce enormous amounts of electricity. The problem is storage. When the sun goes down and the wind stops, all that energy disappears unless you can hold on to it. For years, the answer has been lithium-ion batteries. But lithium is expensive, environmentally destructive to mine, and degrades over time. So the most advanced laboratories on Earth went searching for something better. And what they found is genuinely remarkable. A company called Rondo Energy, backed by some of the biggest names in venture capital and partnered with researchers at MIT, has developed what they call a breakthrough in industrial-scale thermal energy storage. Their technology uses chemically enhanced fire bricks, heated to over 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, using surplus electricity from wind and solar farms. These massive walls of engineered brick hold that heat for days, then release it on demand to power heavy industry, steel mills, cement plants, and chemical factories long after the sun has set. A single ton of these bricks can store the equivalent of over 400 kilowatt-hours of energy at a fraction of the cost and environmental impact of lithium-ion batteries. The bricks do not degrade. They do not require rare earth minerals. They do not catch fire. They just sit there, holding heat, exactly the way bricks have held heat for 4,000 years. Billions of dollars in cutting-edge research, some of the sharpest engineering minds on the planet, and the most advanced thermal modeling computers in existence, and they arrived at the same destination as a 15th-century Russian family building a clay stove, and a 2,000-year-old Chinese farmer designing a Kang. The most advanced thermal battery on Earth is still, at its core, a hot brick. Conclusion. We live in an era where we have outsourced our most basic survival needs to invisible grids, fragile supply chains, and monthly billing cycles. We have been taught, through generations of marketing, that warmth is a luxury we must continuously rent. History says otherwise. The laws of thermodynamics are not subject to market forces. Heat moves into dense mass slowly, and it leaves dense mass slowly. That law existed before the heating industry, and it will be here long after the last space heater ends up in a landfill. A $3 fire brick will not replace your furnace, but that was never the point. The point is this: warmth is a physical property of the Earth, not a product on a shelf. When the grid goes down and the furnace goes silent, the old knowledge still works. Every camper who sleeps warmly through a freezing night without a power cord, every family that rides out a blackout with heated bricks wrapped in wool, is living proof that the most powerful technologies are sometimes the ones we were taught to forget. So here is what you can do tonight. Go to a hardware store, spend $3 on a fire brick, temper it over a few days, learn the feel of it, learn how it holds heat, practice wrapping it safely, put it in your emergency kit beside the flashlights and the water bottles, because the next time the lights go out, you will not be a subscriber waiting for a service to resume. You will be someone who knows what the ancients knew. The Earth holds warmth, and now so do you. Thank you for exploring the past with us. If this journey through history, science, and survival resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to Historia Prime, and share this video with someone who values real independence. Stay warm, stay curious, and we will see you in the next episode.